Welcome back, everyone, to API Days Singapore 2022, Day 2. We just had two great keynote presentations from Manohar and Todd talking about the open finance journey, particularly in Southeast Asia. And there are a lot of great insights from both of those. We're going to continue with the open finance theme in this track, but a couple of things that both Manohar and Todd mentioned were the need for organizations to mature their API capability. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Adrian Hall from Microsoft, specifically to talk about the lessons that Microsoft have learned along the journey of building the API capability at Azure. Welcome, Adrian.
Thank you very much, John. Pleasure to be here.
So I'll just check that you can share your screen. And
yep. Looks good.
Looking forward to learning about the API journey at Microsoft.
Thanks, John, and welcome everyone who's tuning into this broadcast. It's a pleasure to be speaking to you. So my name's Adrian Hall. I am a program manager on Azure, and the specific thing I deal with is I was the chair of the API Stewardship Board, which is it's a council for ensuring that the APIs that Azure produces are consistent, usable, and friendly to consumers, the developers that write applications on top of Azure. And that wasn't always the case. For many reasons, each service team produced their own APIs. And before the API Stewardship Council, there wasn't that much focus on getting them right. So we're going to talk about what we did to add value to the process and to ensure that we weren't getting to a point of adversarial conflict with the service teams, and give you some really good tips for how to develop your own API stewardship council and the journey that you need to go on to. So just a quick market context, and I'm going to skip over this very quickly. Everyone knows that APIs are important. The average company consumes about 32 SaaS provided APIs, and it's the fastest growing area of production in the world. And it's Azure is just one of those. We have somewhat on the order of 25,000 APIs that we make available to the average developer. And they cover all sorts of things, from control plane, like how do I configure a new VM, all the way up to data plane. How do I access a SQL or a Cosmos database, for example? The important thing to note here is APIs are the contract that you have with your customers, the developers of the services that rely on your API. We found that a good API, which we user test and make sure the developers can really use, really makes things easy, to the point where if you've got a good, consistent API across your entire API set, developers don't necessarily need that much documentation to figure out what it's doing. However, a bad one is exactly the opposite. They will spend weeks figuring out exactly how to use it, and they will be frustrated, and they're pretty much going to hate you for producing something that doesn't work. What does good mean? It's easy to use. It's obvious. It's consistent. And we'll talk about some of the things that need to be consistent a little later on. It's aligned with industry standards, and that means that things like REST act the way that the rest of the industry think REST should be. So API stewardship, it's not so much a product as a continual improving practice that helps you impart those good API design into your development process. there are lots of ways to make a difficult API, and in the early days of Azure, we did all of them. Service teams would say, here's our underlying database model. We're just going to expose that through REST. It didn't matter whether the user, the developers that were using it needed that interface or not. And then they said, well, there's Swashbuckle. Let's just throw that into the mix. And hey, we've got code generation now. We'll only build for .NET. And we're continually evolving the product. So we'll just keep the same API. That will work. Obviously, that was a recipe for disaster. And I see this so many times in my work that once you've seen it 20, 25 times across the same with the same mistakes all the time, you tend to go like, okay, there's something wrong here. We need to fix it. So that's why the API Stewardship Board was invented. The problem is APIs stick around much longer than you expect. We've still got customers that are using APIs dated 2009, which was the year the first piece of Azure came out. Most changes are not really found until something breaks. And the way that they break is that your customers, the people, not the developers, which are your customers, but the people that they are developing for, they break. And then they complain to your customers, and it all escalates. So there's this huge downstream effect, and you have to support it. You're stuck with it now because you've got, in some cases, in our case, it's tens of millions of developers relying on those APIs, and changing tens of millions of users is not easy. So you're stuck with the APIs that you invent, and whether you intended to invent them or not. Azure services are pretty much all REST. Every single Azure service has a control plane, which we call Azure Resource Manager, and that has governance in place. We are very, very prescriptive because of our own tooling around how to create and tear down services. But when it comes to the data plane, it's a very much more lightweight process. We have a lot of people within Microsoft. We're blessed with experienced practitioners, people who have been creating APIs for years, and that you'll recognize the names on the board as being the people that are involved with OData, or the people who are involved in REST, or the people who are involved in GraphQL. These are names that you would recognize if you were in those worlds. So our first attempt at the board was called the Azure REST API Review Board, and there's actually a GitHub repo with all of our guidelines by that name, and that looked at APIs as part of a checklist for what we called the Product Launch Review, or PLR. And it was great when Azure was small. We could keep up. We were part of the review. The problem was services bought their APIs to the review right prior to their general availability, when they were going through the PLR. And teams tended to view it as a checkbox item, not as a serious part of the process. And there was a VP exception process that we invented that said, if you want to say that the Azure REST API Review Board doesn't have control, you just get a sign-off from your VP, and that's good enough. The problem there was the VPs, their intent is not to produce good APIs. Their intent is to get their product out to market as soon as possible. So the VPs were inevitably way too eager to sign off on something that should have been done before. So what we decided to do was we rebranded ourselves. We went from review to stewardship, and we started to engage teams during a different phase of their design process. Basically, before the process was actually greenlit, the service was greenlit for inclusion in Azure, we were actually involved there to find ways to get good API design during preview phases. So we have dedicated staff now, PM, hello, an architect. We've got more API stewards so we can get a faster feedback and we can spend more time with the service teams designing their APIs. And we've also got a lot of content and tools to support this capability. And it's been working pretty well. The design phase was really important. We decided to help teams that were in the design phase first. If they were already in GA, you'll see a lot of historical context there, and it's really a lot harder to change those. We also ensured that we were tackling problems where there was the biggest impact for success. A good example of this is thinking about how an API implements searching and paging. We had 5 different ways of implementing paging initially. We settled on one and we drove, this is why you do this. Consistency across those services is rolling out over time, and you'll see more and more services take on this paging capability. Other things that we dealt with were versioning, even things like that you might not consider, like how do you express a rectangle across multiple services became a big sticking point. You know, some people use bottom left, top right. Some people use top left, bottom right. Some people use an origin point and a height and a width, and they're all just 4 numbers at the end of the day. So tackling those capabilities where you need to be able to translate that the way that you think about these objects across a large swath of the API structure is important. So the thing that we found is having clear guidelines helps a lot. Explaining why we have clear guidelines also helps a significant amount. Sometimes it's we had to choose between A and B, and we chose A. There's not really a good reason, but we need to be consistent. We do emphasize consistency, we emphasize simplicity, and we emphasize having a simple cognitive overload for the client developer. And that means that the client developer should know what to expect. They shouldn't have to think about using the API. They should just say, oh, this implements paging. I know what paging is. I can go and do it. We actually share our guidelines publicly. You can search GitHub for in the Azure repos for the Azure REST API guidelines, and github.com/Microsoft/API-guidelines is where everything is stored for us. And there are other services aside from Azure that are introducing their own guidelines now that are building on top of these foundational pieces. The big thing here is have clear guidelines, write them down, and be prepared to defend them, because you will get arguments. Some examples, for example, what do our URLs look like? They'll be if they're consistent, people will know where to go. They'll be expecting it. How to deal with idempotency is a big one, and making sure that people understand what REST actually is and what it is not, and making sure that they return the right thing. I'm going to skip ahead because I am running out of time. We do have discussions about APIs, but I want to actually talk about tools. We found that having an automated process, and you can actually see our API process, again, it's public. It's Azure/Azure-REST-API-specs. And you can see all the PRs that come in to update our APIs. Behind the scenes, there's a whole set of pipelines that are validating that the APIs follow the guidelines. And if they don't follow the guidelines, then a human gets involved. Tooling, incredibly important. I love Spectral for the OpenAPI linter. All of our stuff has evolved into an OpenAPI specification. I love Postman for the API testing. And we have various open API spec viewers. A lot of our teams are now going over to VS Code and the Swagger capabilities within VS Code, but the online editors are also really good. We have augmented the standard spectral rule sets with our own rule sets to check for the guideline following that we have. And we have implemented a tool that detects API changes. When we talk about breaking changes, that's a hugely important one. It's an immediate red flag if someone breaks their API. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about API gateways. API gateways are incredibly useful for consolidating APIs together into a single endpoint and for applying caching, monitoring, visibility, routing, ensuring that all the authorizations are consistent. All those fun things come out of an API gateway without any of the individual service teams worrying about them. It doesn't really matter which API gateway you use, but you should be using one to actually implement these. And the final topic I'll be talking about is versioning and breaking changes. We got a lot of feedback from our customers when we started doing the board, and we went out to our customer base, which was hundreds of thousands of customers, and talked about their API usage. The thing that came up time and time again is, why are you breaking my apps? And so we came up with two requirements that all services must adhere to now. The first is customer workloads must never break due to a service change. And the second one is customers should be able to adopt a new version without requiring code changes. Those seem to be the two things that we can really deal with. And you notice they're very customer centric. They're about the developers using the APIs. And our services now go to great lengths to ensure that we don't break customers. It happens sometimes, particularly when a service has been around a long time and they've not built in this philosophy from the beginning. But the newer services are adopting this from the get-go, and that requires a lot of upfront thinking about how the API will get used. We do take the usage of the APIs. No one uses APIs directly. They all use an SDK, even if they've written that SDK themselves. So we actually place our SDKs. You've got C, C++, Go, C#, Java, JavaScript, TypeScript, Python, Swift, and Kotlin. And each of those languages constrain the problem even further. The memory management in a C language, in an IoT device using C, or in a Go service is very different from a Java or C#, where you've got managed memory. So we have to take those into account. So how do we do it? Every single change that a service does generates a new API version. Now, we name our API versions after dates. We've got a couple of services that are doing API versions with semantic versioning. You don't really version an API. You're really producing a brand new API on top, and the resource state must be backwards and forwards compatible. So there's a lot of thinking about what people can do, and it's all about the customer and their usage of the API. So the lessons learned, I've got 1 minute left. The first 5 are about process. As you establish an API stewardship process, engage your API developers, the API producers early, partner with them, don't be just a reviewer, add value to the process, tell them why certain changes can't be done. Make sure that you're giving them clear guidelines to follow. And don't just consider the API, consider the usage of that API by an SDK as well. The others are around very categorical tooling. Tooling does help. I love Spectral. I love Postman. There are other tools in there I use as well. Use an API gateway that consolidates everything, that makes things like authentication, authorization, logging very easily done. Centralize all your documentation. If your developers that are consuming your APIs have one place to go, it's a win. If your producers have one place to go to get the guidelines, and the capabilities that they need to implement, it's a win. Everyone knows where to go. And finally, versioning. Version every single change to the API, even if you don't think it's not a breaking change. Version everything, and don't ever produce a breaking change, because that means you are breaking your customers, and your customers are a much bigger consumer than you probably expect. So with that, I'll say thank you very much. I am open to questions now, and I'll take a look at the comment here.
Great, thanks very much, Adrian. Lots of great lessons there, and I think that any organization that is either already publishing APIs or preparing to publish APIs can learn something from that. I think it comes down to the general area of lifecycle management of the APIs, and you have a number of examples of things that you've learned along the way. I think a lot of organizations start the way Microsoft did. They start by experimenting, because innovation precedes standards, and so the lessons that you've learned about how to firstly conduct reviews, and then realize that reviews come a little late. And so tell me, when you've appointed stewards for your APIs, are they full-time staff, that's their job, or are they within a development team somewhere that's creating APIs?
They tend to be architects, which are long tenured people in the industry, and the people. I mean, just as for example, Jeffrey Richter is one of our architects. That's the API, our API stewards, and he's got a whole video course on how to produce microservices. And people who are in the industry of microservices probably at some point watched his videos on how to produce services. So that's the kind of, and he has 35 years of experience in the space. That's the sort of people that we're talking about. People who have been in the industry, who have produced lots of APIs, who have done the death by fire drills that are common when you get these things wrong. So they definitely have opinions, and they're the ones that go out. And yes, it's a full-time staff position that is there to help service teams along. So they get assigned to a service team to during the design phase to help them with their API design.
Okay, and you mentioned also the difficulty of communicating with all the API consumers once something is out there, and even though you probably have the email addresses and contact details of the person who originally signed up to use the API, they may not be the same person that's still using it, or just the very challenge that all developers face is that they have to do lots of updates and maintenance on their code, and upgrading to use a new version of someone else's API is one of a number of things that is on their list, and it can take some time to get there if they realize that it is important enough to actually do something about. So the importance of supporting your existing APIs for a lot longer than you may have liked when you publish new versions of things, I think is a key lesson.
Yeah, I have APIs, as I said, from 2009. They're still being used today, and we have a policy within Azure of when we retire an API version, which we're not allowed to do unless there's a security issue or a compelling reason to retire it. when we retire an API version, we still have to support that API version for 3 years beyond the announcement. And we have to actually actively drive the usage down to zero. And that means the service team has to reach out to the service owners and work with them to get their applications changed over to use a newer API version. So there's a lot of if you sign up for Azure, you'll inevitably get these emails on a every 6-month basis saying these are the changes that are happening in Azure that affect you, and that's part of the process. But behind the scenes, we're also doing a lot of work to try and drive that usage down to zero.
Right. Thanks. Thanks very much for sharing that insight and those lessons. I'm gonna find that slide with the 10 lessons there and I'm gonna nail it to my wall because they're very appropriate and everyone who's building their API capability can learn from that. Thanks very much, Adrian.
Thanks, John, and thanks everyone for listening in.